Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Washington Gun Law TV. I'm Washington Gun Law President William Kirk. Thanks for joining us. Hey, have you ever noticed that probably one of the biggest difference between those on the political right and those on the political left is those on the left, anytime an individual finds themselves in trouble, rather than want to hold the individual accountable, it is somebody else's fault or sometimes just society as a whole. And we are beginning to see that mentality seep into the civilian disarmament regime as well when we start seeing lawsuits against Glock because other people are making illegal devices that attach to a Glock. Well, this whole idea of blame shifting is a toxic phenomenon new to the United States, but one that is eroding us from within and one that is now seeping into federal legislation. Don't believe me? I'll give you an example of that today. So today, let's spend a few minutes and let's talk about when blame shifting turns into gun control legislation. Okay, before we get going too far down the road we're going down, proud to announce that this video is being brought to you by Taylor Freelance. Formed in 1994 in Washington State, they've been operating here in beautiful Bellingham, Washington for the last 25 years. Hey, listen, they may have started with the Seattle Slug, but now they're specializing in base plates and brass backstraps. They make parts and components for most major manufacturers, and yes, they can make parts for your pistols, your rifles, and your shotguns. Listen, they live by the motto that more ammo is always better. I live by the motto that, hey, they may not make your firearms, but they're gonna make your firearms a lot better. For more information, visit my good friends at taylorfreelancestore.com/WGL. Okay, America, this is what we're talking about today. We're talking about H.R. 8764, introduced in the United States House of Representatives, the Firearm Procurement Act, sponsored by Democratic House of Representative Jamie Raskin out of the state of Maryland. So anytime we're talking about Jamie Raskin, that should be just about enough to know exactly where this legislation is going. What this piece of legislation would do if enacted into law is, well, it would violate other forms of federal law, but hey, don't let that get in the way of a good gun grab here, right? What this legislation would do would require the Attorney General to publish data, what we call trace data, we'll talk about in a second. Now that is federally protected data, but this piece of legislation would require that the Attorney General publish that data, and then depending on what that data says, that would preclude federal governmental agencies from contracting with certain firearms manufacturers. You go, whoa, my head's spinning. How does that work? This is how it works, okay? If this becomes legislation, what happens is that when the FBI, ATF, anybody like that, files for a trace request, that is, they have found a gun at a crime scene and they now want to trace it back to its origin. If certain gun stores had a certain number of traces over a certain period of time, that would be data that would then be intentionally disclosed to the Attorney General as well as anyone else who wanted to be privy to it. And then that would preclude federal government from entering into contracts with these manufacturers. Now, how do we end up with trace data? We end up requests for trace data when firearms end up at crime scenes. How do most firearms end up at crime scenes? Well, they first are stolen, lost, or misplaced. They end up into the wrong hands, and then they end up at a crime scene. So essentially what the congressman wants to do here is he wants to now be able to hold firearms manufacturers financially responsible, burden them financially because of the illegal activity of third parties. And then understand, for example, let's just take Glock, okay? Let's say that Glock firearms show up at crime scenes, which is highly probable, not because Glock's doing anything wrong, not because the FFLs are doing anything wrong, but because there's so many of them in circulation. But if that were the case, and suddenly they get blacklisted by the United States Attorney General, again, because of illegal activity of others, then the United States Marshals, any federal law enforcement office, any Department of Fish and Wildlife, any other federal agency that has any kind of a law enforcement or security division would be precluded from contracting with that manufacturer moving forward. Now, Representative Raskin is pitching this as, hey, we get to go after all the bad Apple gun dealers. But you see, Representative Raskin, that's where you're dead wrong, because the last time I checked, the only way that you can walk into an FFL in the United States, I don't care what state you're in, and walk out of there with a firearm is, shockingly, you have to fill out a 4473. Shockingly, the FFL has to run a complete background check on you through the NICS system. Shockingly, the FBI, the ATF, and the Department of Justice all have to okay it. And then and only then, when the FFL receives the proceed, is the individual allowed to walk out of the store, unless, of course, there's a statutory waiting period like we have in Washington and there are in many other states, in which it doesn't matter when the proceed comes in, they're going to have to come back a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later to pick up the firearm. But there is no method by which an FFL can actually be a bad apple unless they just ignore federal laws altogether. And as I have mentioned before, this would be akin to any time we have a drunk driving accident in which some innocent driver gets slaughtered on the freeway because of some stupid drunk behind the wheel, that we suddenly start talking about banning either the booze or the automobiles. You see, because that's not what happens. What we do is we talk about the idiot who was behind the steering wheel, just like we should talk about all the maniacs who find themselves behind triggers, oftentimes unlawfully. Now, you guys may not know this, but there's already current legislation called the Tyhart Amendment that says, hey, listen, all of these trace requests are meant to be private. It's only meant to be shared amongst law enforcement so we can continue to try to solve crimes. And listen, a disclosure of this, which has happened once before, has led to some embarrassing circumstances. For example, a lot of people don't know this, but the District of Columbia at one point had no FFL inside the District of Columbia. I know, shocker, right? And so the DC Police Department was acting as the FFL. Unfortunately, when more than 25 of the firearms that they had been responsible for transferring turned up at crime scenes, it was then disclosed to the folks in the District of Columbia that, yeah, your DC Police Department, yeah, they're your local FFL as well. But here's the thing. Do we honestly think that the DC police wasn't following all federal regulations? Of course not. They were running background checks, and knowing DC, they were not releasing a firearm to any person who was not absolutely positively qualified and lawful to possess that firearm. And yet, these firearms still turned up at crime scenes. Once again, the DC Police Department was subjected to scrutiny merely because of the illegal and unlawful activity of third persons. And of course, if we just take a look at the United States Department of Justice's own statistics, which I'm going to assume that Representative Raskin is privy to as well, we know that 88.8% of all gun crimes that are committed in the United States are actually committed by individuals who are unlawfully possessing the firearm at the time the crime is committed. How many of those individuals could have actually obtained the firearm through an FFL? Well, of those 88.8%, the answer is 0. Listen, it's very hard to take just about anything that Representative Raskin says with a straight face. I mean, he has operated in the fringe of the left wing of this party for a long, long time, and he is clearly trying to placate some of his base. The likelihood that this legislation ever truly sees the light of day is pretty remote, but it goes to show you that those on the gun-grabbing left will, in fact, stop at nothing to disarm you, the lawful and responsible gun-owning American. Listen, he hasn't even published the full text of the bill yet. We'll go ahead and put the link down there so you can geek out on it when and if the good representative ever gets around to actually putting the text of the bill there. Maybe you got questions about this or anything else related to what's left of our Second Amendment rights. If you guys do, you can always contact Washington Gun Law. If you don't know how to do that, that information is down there in the description box. Maybe you got ideas for videos we should be doing here at Washington Gun Law. If you do, click on that link right there. Most of the best ideas we ever had actually weren't our ideas to begin with. And then finally, and most importantly, let's everyone remember that part of being a lawful and responsible gun owner, like we talk about all the time here, is to know what the law is in every situation, how it applies to you in any instance that you may find yourself. Until next time, thanks for watching, and stay safe.